I want to tell you a story. I want to tell you a story that most of you probably know better than I do. So you can tell me later what I got wrong. On September 10th, 2001, this church voted to invest its congregation's endowment in a bold vision. You set out to build a school for the community and to repair a sagging sanctuary ceiling and to keep this church alive. And the next day, the world changed. Our country was attacked and your hearts turned to grieving. And the value of your endowment fell sharply. And you prayed. You prayed not only for the world that seemed to be breaking apart, not only for the loved ones whose lives were touched by tragedy, not only for our nation seeking a way forward, but you prayed for your church, for this church, wondering aloud to God what the future would hold. When Paul was in prison, he wrote a prayer to a new church in Philippi. And churches in those days were asking themselves some hard questions too. They were small. None of them owned their own buildings, and they wondered what kind of future God had in store for them, and so they prayed. And they prayed not just for the world, not just for their families and friends, but they prayed for their church, wondering aloud to God what the future would hold. And Paul prayed for them too. From prison, Paul wrote, "This is my prayer for you, that your love might grow with knowledge and discernment. I pray that you will be able to discern what really matters, so that you will be sincere and blameless. And I pray that you will be filled with the fruit of righteousness, which comes from Jesus Christ, in order to give glory and praise to God. This is my prayer. This is my prayer, that your love will grow with knowledge and discernment, so that you can see where God is calling you and follow, and so your ministry will bear fruit and God will be glorified." Paul said, "I pray that your love will grow with knowledge and discernment." And my friends, we need both. We need knowledge and we need discernment. We need knowledge in order to bear the fruit for God. We need wise leaders, people who can keep a good eye on the books, people who can tell us when we're a few years away from needing a new boiler, people who can tell us if there's a vital piece of our spiritual life together that is being missed. We need knowledge. We need to know our history. We need to know where we have come from. And we need to know our history well enough that we can revere the foundation that is laid beneath us. And we need to know our history well enough to know what mistakes to avoid. And you and I need knowledge in our everyday lives. We need to know the balance in the checking account. We need to know what bills are coming up. We need to remember if this Wednesday was baseball or was it dance, and were you going to pick up the kids or was I? We need to remember how to do our work. We need to know when to rest. We need to know our limits. We need to know who we can rely on. We need to know where we're going. We need knowledge. And this is my prayer, that you will have all the knowledge you need, and that your love will grow with knowledge and discernment, because we need them both, knowledge and discernment. A mentor of mine, Martin Copenhaver, often says this: discernment is the task of figuring out what God is doing and how we are meant to respond. Discernment is the task of figuring out what God is doing and how we are meant to respond. I pray that your love will grow with knowledge and discernment. I pray that you will know what you need to know, and that you will figure out what God is doing and how you are meant to respond. You were here, many of you. I wasn't. So you can tell me later if I'm wrong. But I suspect that if all you had was knowledge, that school would have never been built. And this sanctuary might not still be standing, because after those attacks, all the smart people were afraid. The knowledgeable people were cautious. But you had knowledge and discernment. Your knowledge kept you from being reckless, but in your discernment, you were never quite able to let go of the idea that God was calling you to be part of something new, something hopeful, and something beautiful, and so you prayed. Not just for the world, not just for the ones that you loved, not just for our nation, but you prayed for your church, for this church, wondering aloud to God what the future would hold, and then you put on hard hats and you stuck spades into the earth and you built the hope that you had for this community. And here we are, 14 years later, and look what God was doing. It's a good thing we figured out how to be a part of it. This is my prayer, that your love will grow with knowledge and discernment, and that you will be filled with the fruits of righteousness which come from Jesus Christ in order to give glory and praise to God. This church has at least one experience of the courage that it takes to follow God's call, what it takes to discern what God is up to and how we are to be a part of it. And even if you weren't here when that all happened, because I wasn't, it's your story too. Because this isn't just a story about who this church was. It's a story about who we are. We are faithful people who have plenty of knowledge, but also the courage to practice discernment, to listen for God's small and persistent voice and to follow where it calls. Maybe something like this has happened in your own life. A still, small, persistent voice that calls you to some place unexpected, that beckons you to do something that seems to defy common sense. I've been here for 6 days now, and I already know that one of this community's great gifts is that you have been there. You know what that's like, and so this is a place where people can find the knowledge and the discernment and the courage to follow God's call. There's a woman named Sarah Miles who was a freelance journalist. She lived in San Francisco, but her work took her to lots of places of tragedy and suffering. She covered wars in Latin America, and she wasn't a church person. Never had been. Her parents didn't take her, and she didn't feel like she was missing much. All the pain that she had witnessed made the whole thing feel a little bit frivolous to her anyway. But as a journalist, she had one trait, and that was curiosity. She was curious about just about everything. So one cloudy morning when she was 46 years old, out of this nagging sense of curiosity, she walked into the back of an Episcopal church, walked right up front, and took communion. A bite of bread and a sip of wine, and her life was never the same. In her autobiography, she writes, "That moment led me against all my expectations to a faith I had scorned and a work I had never imagined. As I was being fed at that table, I realized that what I was meant to do was feed people. And so she did. Sarah founded a food pantry at her church, handing out free groceries to hundreds of families every week, right off the top of the very communion table where she was first fed by Christ. She left behind a life she knew to take part in something new that God was doing. Nothing that dramatic has ever happened to me. Maybe not for you either. But our lives are still full of stories like that, of God reaching into our lives and turning us towards something new. It's usually just that small, persistent voice that builds over years and years and gently redirects us and calls us towards something unimagined. I pray that you have discernment. Discernment, that spiritual discipline of staying open to new possibilities, of asking God for guidance, of listening to our own lives and to other people and to the experiences that God might be speaking to us through. I believe that God is calling this church to continue with its gift of courageous discernment. I believe that God is calling us to help one another uncover God's call for each of our lives and to work together to discern where God is calling this church next. We'll need all our knowledge, all our wisdom, all our smarts, and it'll take us far, but it will only take us where God is leading if we join it with discernment, if we pray, if we keep our hearts open to God and we listen to one another. The last piece of Paul's prayer might be the most important. Paul prays for the church's love to grow in knowledge and discernment so that you may be blameless on the day of Christ and bear the fruit that comes through Jesus Christ for the glory of God. In other words, our love is meant to grow with all the knowledge we need, with hearts that can discern God's call so that we can bear fruit for God's sake. The growth of our love, our knowledge, our discernment, it's not meant merely to improve our lives or to make this church bigger and better. It's meant so that we can bear fruit for God's sake, so that we can be Christ's presence to this community, so that we can be who God needs us to be for the sake of the world. This is my first Sunday as your new pastor. And I'm excited when I imagine what God might have in store for our time together. And I'm so grateful that I get to walk this next leg of my faith journey with you. So for our first sermon, I'm just going to leave it with Paul's reliable prayer to the church that he loved in Philippi. It's my prayer, too, for a church I love in Milton. I thank my God every time I remember you, constantly praying with joy in every one of my prayers for you. Because of how you have shared the good news from the first day until now, I'm confident. I'm confident that the good work that God has begun among us, God will bring to completion. And I pray that our love may grow to overflowing with knowledge and discernment to help us determine what is best, so that in the day of Christ we may be blameless, having produced a great harvest for the glory and the praise of God. This is my prayer.